Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Nuclear Mythbusting. The purpose of this session really is kind of what it says on the tin. It's to bust some myths. There's perhaps no branch of science that has more to offer the world than nuclear, and yet is so misunderstood so widely in industry and within the public. And so we've come to set the record straight. I'm going to be the moderator. Today I'm Dr. Tim Gregory from the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory. I work in the lab mostly, so it's kind of nice to be out of the lab. They do let me out occasionally to come and mingle and talk to our fantastic panelists. We have Dr. Charlene Smith, who is an engineer, senior nuclear energy analyst at the Breakthrough Institute in Washington, DC. We've got Christine Madden, who is the president of the International Youth Nuclear Congress. And over on the far side, we've got Mira Al-Balushi, who is a senior program engineer at the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, and they're going to bust some myths for us this afternoon. So I guess we'll start with maybe the elephant in the room and the thing that, at least, you know, when you talk to the public about nuclear power, nuclear energy, it's rolling net zero. One of the things that comes up very early on in the conversation is the safety record of nuclear. It's perhaps one of the biggest myths, is that nuclear energy is unsafe. So what do we think about that? Do we want to address that? Should we start with you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. So let's bust some myths. So from the perspective of safety, when you talk about safety, safety is a condition of being unlikely to cause harm, danger, or death, right? So when we think about safety in a larger context, most people, if you ask them, you know, is flying a plane safe or taking a flight safe? They would tell you yes. And so when we talk about safety, we're really looking at probabilities. And so with respect to energy production and different energy sources that we use, nuclear energy ranks among the lowest as regards to the amount of deaths that are incurred and as a result of accidents, as a result of air pollution, per terawatt hour. So there is a specific graphic that's published by Our World in Data, and that graphic is essentially showing the deaths per accidents and per air pollution per energy source per terawatt hour. Follow me. And nuclear energy, if you look at that graphic, ranks on the low side. It's very close to solar and wind. So if you look at that graphic, you're going from the safest to least safe energy source, and that rank starts with solar in first place. Nuclear is actually number 2. Wind is number 3. Gas is number 4. And hydro is number 4. Gas is number 5. Biomass, oil, and then coal. And that is considering all the accidents as well that came as a part of the nuclear energy industry's past transgressions. And so, yes, we do have a history of major accidents, and so does other energy sources. But when we take a stock of the seriosity and the impact that those accidents have had compared to all other energy sources, nuclear energy actually ranks among the safest.
So that's a very scientific answer, putting numbers to the question of how safe is nuclear. Yeah. I think a lot of it often comes from a kind of an emotional response. I don't know if that's something that you've come across in your work and going out and do nuclear advocacy.
Yeah, and I think, having worked in nuclear power plants at the beginning of my career, one of the things that I always thought was really interesting is there's such a high focus on safety in the workplace. Even things like making sure the door is closed, properly closed in order to the fire doors. And so I would find myself actually doing this in my house because it became so ingrained in my day-to-day behavior. And I think that, that's just one example of of the importance that we put on nuclear safety. And one of the things that I really appreciate about working in the nuclear industry is that we have this really high renaissance for the fact that you have to come to work with a questioning attitude. It doesn't matter what your rank is in the facility, how many years of experience you have, etc. If you see something that you don't think is okay, it's your responsibility to bring that forward, and there's not going to be repercussions for that. And I think that's amazing from the perspective that it really creates this culture where people can feel comfortable and confident raising issues, whether it's related to the way that a procedure is written, whether it's related to the fact that you maybe have a barrier in the field that you weren't anticipating in your pre-job brief. But I think these sorts of things are so important in terms of building a culture where everyone feels heard and respected.
That, I think it's the culture kind of gets to the heart of it completely. It's kind of like a self-correction almost that just kind of gets better with time. You kind of hone the edges. Is that something that you kind of experience as a program engineer? That kind of culture of self-correction, being able to speak out, make suggestions around safety and the culture?
Absolutely. So my experience is very similar to Krista's experience. So the power plants that we have in the UAE are, the first in the region. And I think when people hear the word nuclear, they immediately think, ooh, is it safe to work over there? And when I started working, like when you look at the processes, the procedures, and how the focus, like safety is the overriding priority all the time. And as Kristen said as well, yes, you always, you have that safety culture. You can always suggest, and again, safety is the overriding priority.
Have you seen a shift in the public perception of nuclear since the power plant started recently?
I would say that, like in the UAE, there might be misconceptions about nuclear energy, but most of the people do have a lot of trust in the government. So we don't really have like anti-nukes or people who are anti-nuclear, but I'm sure that some people really do not have the right conceptions about nuclear energy.
Sure.
But they do still support it.
Okay, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got the power plant, it's running, it's all safe, it's great. The other elephant in the room, the second elephant, it perhaps glows in the dark in people's minds when they imagine it in the public. This is, of course, nuclear waste, an unavoidable byproduct of generating any form of electricity or extracting energy from natural resources. You get waste as a byproduct. Nuclear waste sounds awful. People are scared of it. People are worried about it. Is it the showstopper that people think it is? Should it stop us reaching net zero by 2050? Is it worth it? What are your thoughts?
So from my perspective, I actually think that this is one of the things that sets nuclear apart. The fact that in the cost per megawatt hour, we include the cost of waste and waste management, and we ensure that the waste is stored and maintained in a safe configuration. And to my knowledge, we're the only industry that does that. So this wasn't just because I was thirsty, but it's a prop. So this soda can is the equivalent of all the nuclear waste that would be generated if all of your electricity during your entire lifetime came from nuclear energy. So this would it would fit into one, essentially, can of soda. But the cool thing about nuclear technology, nuclear fuel, is that actually about 90% of it is recyclable. So if we were to recycle it, as they do in some countries like France, for instance, this would actually be the waste of 10 people, not just one. And so in the nuclear industry, we put a lot of emphasis on ensuring that the nuclear fuel is maintained in safe configurations when they're in these large swimming pools adjacent to the nuclear reactor. And then later on, we put them in dry storage. So these are really large concrete containers where we've safely and robustly stored them for generations, following which some countries do decide to recycle. And the idea of these concrete containers is also they're meant for us to be able to go back in and recycle at a later date should that country choose to make that decision. In the nuclear field, or I would say in the broader energy context, nuclear energy is one of the few energies that we really put an emphasis on ensuring that the nuclear material is maintained in a safe and robust configuration. And we haven't had any issues to date. And we're always innovating. And I think that's also the really exciting thing, is that we have these new reactors, advanced breeder reactors potentially coming online in the next decade or two, which will really even further reduce the amount of waste that there is. And I think that's really important from a generational justice perspective, and that we want to leave the future generations with the least amount of waste as possible. But we also want to ensure that when there is waste, that it is maintained in a safe configuration and that it's manageable.
So with a mind to environmental stewardship and sustainability and recycling of nuclear waste, do you anticipate that that will become more and more prevalent as we go forward in the coming decades? Will more and more countries, do you think, take, as you say, a French-style approach to recycling nuclear waste and increasing the capacity for that?
Yeah, I think from a sustainability perspective, that is something that we could see become more popular as we go forward. Like Kristen mentioned, more than 90% of that material can be reused. And I think when we talk about especially the waste, just to add on to what she was saying earlier, it's really only about 4% of spent fuel that really has extremely long-lived isotopes, the ones that stay radioactive for thousands of years. But with new technologies like the sodium-cooled fast reactors or the breeder reactors, you can take that material that has a long radiotoxicity lifetime and reduce the radioactivity of that material through reuse and reprocessing down to being radioactive for thousands of years to hundreds of years. And that really targets exactly what we're trying to push forward from not only a sustainability perspective, where we can continually reuse the waste, which is an energy resource, but also from the point of view of, we're reducing the radiotoxicity of the byproducts that we produce from the energy source.
Sure, and I think something that's often lost in the conversation about net zero and sustainability is that there's a cost to everything. There's no perfect solution, only trade-offs. But you've just demonstrated that the trade-off of nuclear waste is actually quite small, about the size of a soda can.
Yeah, and I think on the cost of that as well, I think countries like the U.S., where some of the reasons that I've heard at least that we're not reprocessing is that there is a proliferation risk, or the notion that it's cheaper to mine for fresh uranium than to reprocess spent fuel. We're talking about more than 2 times the cost of that. So it's not a matter of a technology issue where it's, we can't reprocess it. We have countries that have demonstrated that. And I think we need to start thinking from, we need to get out of the thinking of short-sightedness and try to think more long-term about how we can, create a sustainable energy mix. But for the proliferation side, and at least Kristen can speak a bit more to why that could be a blockade, if you will, for us to, stay away or try to diverge from reprocessing as much as, or as fast as we can.
I think that kind of short-term thinking that you just kind of touched on there is something that I think about a lot, and I know speaking to other people think about a lot as kind of the youth, the sort of the younger generation think about net zero and climate change. What comes after net zero is something that we need to be thinking about as well. Making better use of our resources, spinning them out further. So if recycling isn't economical now, will it be in the future? I don't know what sort of aspirations you have for the future of nuclear in UAE and spinning out those resources further, making better use of the waste that comes out of reactors through French-style recycling.
I'm not quite sure what are the long-term plans for the waste that we have right now, but for short-term, we do store them on site.
Yeah. Cool. I think it's interesting what's going on in Finland as well with the geological repository. I strongly suspect more countries will be making similar pieces of infrastructure, certainly before 2050, as net zero becomes more prevalent. So we've touched on the safety, we've touched on the nuclear waste. I guess the third big pillar that kind of, a lot of the myths around nuclear rest upon is the cost associated with nuclear energy. It's got a terrible reputation for being expensive. So let's say we've sorted the safety problem, nuclear waste, no problem. But are we going to bankrupt ourselves by investing heavily in nuclear?
I think, at least from a cost perspective, there are multiple contributors that drive the cost of old nuclear and even new nuclear. And a big part of that is the regulatory uncertainty and regulatory burdens. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that, yes, of course, I mean, compared to other energy sources, nuclear energy requires a larger upfront cost. But again, thinking about that longevity of what nuclear energy can offer compared to other energy sources as complements is something that is a missing piece of the equation, right? We require nuclear energy is very energy dense, and we have our reactors can stay powered for 100 years, right? And so that becomes a part of the conversation that gets lost, because when you extrapolate the timeline of and the energy that a nuclear power plant is able to offer compared to other energy sources, it becomes very economically viable. The main concern, at least here, is upfront cost. But we have ways that we can try to address this. I mean, I think the UAE is an extremely good example. I think they spent $24 billion on their 4 units, 1.4 gigawatts each, which would turn out to be about $6 billion per unit. But even with advanced reactors, you can generally extrapolate that down to say, if you wanted to build the largest small modular reactor, if we're taking that if we're using those numbers, we can extrapolate, we can look back down and say that the 300 megawatt SMR at most would cost $1 billion. But that's the largest SMR you can possibly have in that energy range. And so I think there are things that we can do, especially at least in the US. I think the regulatory barrier is a huge one that is currently driving the cost of nuclear and trying to and dissuading investors from investing in nuclear. But at the same time, we do have examples of leadership to look at that we can learn from. But also we have advanced small modular reactors that that promise to be more cost effective than our larger conventional reactors. So there are things that we can do to eliminate or to significantly reduce the cost, because as I've said, UAE has done an extremely admirable and inspiring job with Baraka.
So what can we learn from UAE? If you did it on budget, and how do we replicate that? Because I know that in the UK we've got a couple of new reactors in the pipeline, and they generally run over cost. How do we keep that down?
So I think what makes the UAE a bit different is that it's funded by the government, while in other countries, the nuclear industry is, a private sector. So, and I think the UAE is really not only focusing on, spending on nuclear power plants, but really having that energy mix. We have the solar panels, we have wind turbines, and also the power plants. And I'm sure that there are going to be more plans in the future for, to meet the net zero for 2050.
And do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, so I would just add that, there's also been a recent study done by the U.S. Department of Energy that looked at this coal to nuclear transition. And so what this found was that 85% of retired and operating coal facilities in the U.S. can actually easily be transitioned to nuclear facilities. And in doing so, you're actually recycling a lot of that infrastructure at that coal facility. And on average, what they found was that would save about $1 billion in cost from the perspective of being able to use the grid, the steam generators, the existing infrastructure, as well as allow for 90% reduction. And then I think one of the things we also have to remember is we're starting to build new nuclear power plants. They're first of a kind technologies for many of us. So we haven't really built nuclear power plants consistently in decades. So there's a learning curve in terms of the project management, in terms of getting being resource ready, having the suppliers. So with any project that's new to the market, the first few are always going to cost a lot more. But once we have that infrastructure in place, so we have the people, we have the suppliers, we have the regulatory framework, you're going to also see the costs dramatically decrease. And I think that's also what's so interesting about the small modular reactor concept, because essentially it's the same nuclear power plant, being output from the same facility. So it's assembly line. And what we've seen with assembly lines, for instance, in the car manufacturing industry, cars used to be extremely expensive when they were one of a kind. And then when you built this assembly line approach, the cost of those cars over time decreased dramatically, such that the accessibility to more and more people became a viability.
Do you think that small modular reactors kind of add an element of market competition? Because it's one of the exciting things, I think, is seeing they're almost like startups with their own ideas about what a small modular reactor looks like, and that kind of competition inevitably does two things: drives innovation. Overused phrase, of course, but I think in this sense is very fitting, but brings cost down as well. Do you think that will play a big part in the future with the deployment of SMRs?
I actually think it already is. We recently saw a few countries sign an agreement yesterday where they're actually going to collaborate on infrastructure development, specifically around advanced reactors and SMRs. So they're already laying the framework for when we start building these nuclear power plants in the next 5 to 10 years. So I definitely think that plays a huge role. And as you said, innovation is always going to push us in a positive direction.
Sure. So it's kind of related to cost, but another one of the myths surrounding nuclear is that it's just something for rich countries to do. The amount of money that you need to build and operate a nuclear power station are so astronomical that it's really only something that the developed world, that wealthy countries can indulge in. What do you have to say about that? Is it just technology for the developed world, or can it also help the developing world industrialize whilst promoting environmental stewardship?
I would love to see developing countries be able to afford to build, but of course, I mean, they are not developed and may not have as much capital as at their disposal to be able to do that. And in my case, Jamaica is the only Caribbean island that has expressed interest in introducing nuclear energy as a part of our energy mix, right? And then, but the question comes of, well, okay, who's going to pay for it, right? I think using the model that the United States has, especially in the Inflation Reduction Act, where you're incentivizing investors globally to invest in that industry in a particular country. And although the Inflation Reduction Act is something that is great for the U.S., for smaller developing countries like Jamaica, who may say they want to build SMRs, I think the framework of the IRA has an unintended consequence of maybe taking investors or investor money from building out energy technologies in developing countries to the U.S. because the IRA makes investing in nuclear and clean energy technology so attractive. Yep. And I think for developing countries, they should try to replicate a model that is similar for them, and that's directly coming from the government to try to help to incentivize those investments within the region. So it's not just a thing where, because Jamaica's government can't afford an SMR reactor by themselves. And so trying to foster an environment where we can have public and private partnerships come together in the Caribbean region, government perspective to be able to do that is a pathway that I think developing countries could explore.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the cost structure, if you have good projects such that you have designs that we know work, you have the people to operate the facilities, and you have the supply chain, I think that that's also going to drive investment, because a lot of these projects, as we touched on in the earlier question, the issue with them running over costs is that, you know, one of these elements is missing. And so, you know, as more and more reactors come online, we're going to have more and more suppliers. Our project management's going to be refined. Within the nuclear industry, we're extremely collaborative. So, you know, there is, of course, the marketing element, but at the same time, there's also the element that we're going to share our best practices with you and also our failures so that we can all succeed. So I think that as, you know, we get the supply chain in place, we build the pilot plants so we can show that, you know, the designs work. We have the people in place. Then when these governments on the front end invest in, you know, the feasibility studies, I think that then they have the viability of going to external investors, private capital firms, banks, and saying, listen, I have this great project. I have the supply chain in place. I have the technology works. I have the people to operate it and to construct it. And that's a really good sell once you get there. So I think that it's also about like working with partners like the IAEA, whose pavilion we're in today. They have this phased approach that helps countries get there. So I think it's about, you know, building upon this collaborative environment that we have in the operating realm, and that has been further transposed into, you know, the new build realm.
Yeah, that collaborative spirit is definitely something that I feel, for sure, being part of the nuclear community. Is that something that you would say is felt strongly here as a sort of nuclear newcomer on the global scene, that kind of collaborative spirit?
Yes, so we always say that the nuclear world is very small, and you know, because the nuclear power plants are new to our region, so we did really need that support from, you know, like the other nuclear organizations. We do attend a lot of meetings, like in the US and with different organizations that can help support us, you know, getting the trainings that we need, getting the knowledge that we need, and then, as Kristen said, in the future, it makes it easier to, you know, add on to the nuclear power plants that you have, because you already have the knowledge, you already have the experience, because, you know, it's a startup. We have a lot of people who were there during the construction and during the operation of the plant. So if the UAE decides to have more power plants in the future, we have those individuals who have been there, you know, through the whole process of, you know, building the reactors and operating them.
Yeah, cool.
Read a statistic that the UAE actually had over 50 nationalities involved in the construction and the
50?
in the commissioning. Wow. So you're not just training a local workforce anymore, you're training a global workforce.
I'd say it's very diverse, and that comes with its challenges, of course, but you also have experienced people from all around the globe. And since we're talking about diversity, I think it's also worth of mentioning that we have 20% of the people who work in our project are actually females, which is one of the highest numbers worldwide, which I also think is a great thing for the UAE, and it shows support for females as well, since the three of us are females here today.
Nice. So, shifting tact ever so slightly, I feel like we've done the big three. We've done the safety, the expense, and we've talked about nuclear waste. We're at COP. There are delegates, organisations from literally every single country on the planet, all with their own ideas about how we reach net zero. The conversation about sustainability, particularly when it comes to electricity and energy, is dominated by renewables, namely wind and solar. People tend not to talk very much about the biggest source of renewable energy on the planet, which is hydro. People are very, very focused on wind and solar. Do we need nuclear at all, given that wind and solar are becoming more prevalent? They're set to become far more prevalent over the coming decades. They're falling in price. People are investing in them like crazy. Do we even need nuclear? Do we even need to go there? We'll start with you.
Okay, so the question is, why do we need nuclear if we have other renewable sources of energy? And my question is, why not? So if we compare nuclear energy with the other renewable energy resources, it's available 24/7, regardless of the external factors, which makes the grid stable. Nuclear power plants also have one of the highest capacity factors. On average, it's 90%, which is higher than the other renewable energy sources. And if we're looking to meet our energy demands in the future, we need a dense source of energy that is also clean, and only nuclear can provide us with that. And I think people generally underestimate the value of nuclear power, or how much electricity we get from nuclear energy. So the amount of energy you can get from 5 nuclear reactors is equivalent to 3.7 million solar panel rooftops, which is quite a lot. So the question should be, why wouldn't nuclear be part of our energy mix? I think it should be a vital part of our energy mix.
Do you think it's possible without nuclear?
It's just my personal opinion, looking at the energy demands in the future and how the energy demands have increased in the past decades. I don't think it would be possible without nuclear. We need that dense source of energy.
Yeah.
I agree. I think globally, nuclear energy has to be a part of the solution. We're not saying that nuclear energy is appropriate for every country. There are different countries that have their own energy mixes that are appropriate for them, to the point where they don't need, as we talked about, St. Lucia and St. Kitts and Nevis, who have immense geothermal capability, and geothermal has very high capacity factor, right? There was a study that was done by the University of the West Indies that said that at least St. Kitts and Nevis had 90% geothermal capacity.
Wow.
That's their firm, clean baseload power. There's no need to try to introduce nuclear to St. Kitts and Nevis, for example.
Yeah.
And for the case of Jamaica, yes, we're in the Caribbean. We have sunlight for most of the year. We have solar, we have wind, but more than 85% of our energy comes from imported oil. And so in the case of Jamaica, we do have hydro capacity. It's very low, right? So it's kind of looking at, okay, what value do you have, or what can a region do for itself? In Jamaica, we have very low hydro capability. We don't have any geothermal. We have solar and wind and oil. What we're trying to do here is to displace the oil, right? Because what we want is firm energy, and it so happens to that we also want it to be clean. Now, in some cases, when I talk to people in the Caribbean pavilion, they're saying that, well, the Caribbean is among the countries that have the least emissions. We're not the drivers of climate change, which is true. But on the other hand, you can think of it as, you want to be able to achieve your global net zero commitments, yes.
Yep.
But I think nuclear energy has a lot to offer small and developing nations like Jamaica for the advancing the socioeconomic infrastructure of the country. Jamaica exports bauxite. We could, use a small modular reactor, for example, to drive that industry. We would create new industries to desalinate water, for hydrogen production, and build out a very prosperous socioeconomic structure in Jamaica. Electricity is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
I did a study the other day where I was looking at the cost of electricity in Canada versus the cost of electricity in Jamaica, in Ontario specifically, where their energy mix is mostly nuclear energy and renewables and a little bit of gas. In Jamaica, it's mostly oil and a little bit of renewables. On average, the average Jamaican is spending 11% of their income on their electricity bill alone.
Wow.
That is without air conditioning, that is without hot water, compared to the average Canadian living in Ontario, let's say in the US, because I'm in the US. It's only 4% of their income.
Right.
And Americans are very wasteful about energy, have air conditioning, have hot water. And so there is a huge disparity that can directly be linked to the source of energy that is being used in these regions. And so I think beyond even nuclear energy being a part of the net zero solution, it's definitely something that can boost economies all around the world.
Yeah, I like that as a means to grow economies and develop nations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
And adding to that, the International Energy Agency in their 2023 update to the Net Zero Roadmap found that a low case for nuclear use, so around decreasing it to 3%, would actually increase electricity bills by $20 billion globally and require an additional $500 billion in investment costs if we were to go to 3% nuclear from the 9% that they're projecting, the more than doubling. So as you said, this really illustrates the fact that, this can have a significant impact from a social perspective on access to things like education, clean water, etc. So there's so many other applications, the non-electric applications of nuclear, that I think also make it a really exciting technology when we look at the broader framework of the UN SDGs.
Nice. So, with 25 minutes to go, are there any audience questions or any myths in the audience that people would like to put to our expert panel? We talk about the energy density of nuclear. Well, we've got expert density on this panel, so pick their brains while they're in front of you. Have we got any? No?
I can talk about a question I got
Yeah,
recently.
sure. Yeah.
So I was in the Caribbean Pavilion. I think I was in the Bahamas pavilion here. And, I posed a question about nuclear energy, and there were many concerns that primarily stemmed from the fact that, the Caribbean is comprised of very small islands. And, the response was that nuclear energy isn't safe because these small islands are vulnerable to natural disasters. But the thing is that nuclear power plants or nuclear reactors are designed specifically to withstand natural disasters. Anything from tornadoes to floods to hurricanes to earthquakes, all of it. It's specifically designed within the technology to be to withstand these events. And so my example, I can share a spreadsheet of some data that I've collected, is that I've looked back 40 to 50 years of hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes that have hit, close to or even been where the earthquake epicenter was at a nuclear power plant, and we've never heard of that accident, right? The only one that we can pinpoint is Fukushima.
Yeah.
Right? And we can pinpoint it for very, very specific reasons. But throughout the course of history, since the beginning of us building nuclear power plants, there have been natural disasters. Fukushima isn't the first tsunami that we've seen affect a nuclear power plant. But the thing is that for all the other cases that we have never heard of, the plant did exactly what it was designed to do. In the case of Fukushima, yes, we had the earthquake, right? And in response to the earthquake, the reactor did exactly what it was designed to do. It shut down. It shut itself down. So what that means is that you're no longer producing fission. Fission isn't occurring to produce heat, right? What's happening then once the reactor is shut down is that you have radioactive decay, and you produce heat through radioactive decay. So even though you're not actively fissioning anything, you're still producing heat. The procedure then is to have emergency cooling system kick in, right? The problem with Fukushima was not the design of the reactor, it was the design of the plant. The emergency cooling system was located in the basement, right? Naturally, you have an earthquake, great, the reactor is shut down. Here comes a tsunami, your emergency cooling system is in the basement, the tsunami floods that cooling system. Now you no longer have a method or a way to cool your reactor, so your reactor keeps on getting hotter and hotter and hotter to the point where it's boiling off, right? And you have the fuel element that's being exposed, and chemical interactions cause the production of hydrogen, and through that you essentially get a hydrogen explosion, and that's exactly what happened.
So it wasn't a nuclear explosion?
It was a hydrogen explosion,
Yes,
right? But of course, you have radioactive material
For sure.
in the core, and so that released radioactive material into the atmosphere. But the thing is that there were other plants that were even closer to the epicenter of the earthquake, but because of their plant design, whether they were much more elevated than Fukushima, those systems, those plants weren't affected.
Yeah.
And so I think as we approach, building out SMRs on small island developing nations that are prone to natural disasters like Jamaica, we should really robustly put into the plans of the technology and in the area that we've selected to, be extreme in the way that in what we plan for, right? Because climate change, of course, we don't expect to slow down anytime soon, right? So we're going to be expecting more extreme events, right? And so in the planning of building a small modular reactor, a nuclear power plant in these small island developing nations, we do what we typically do anyway, right? Design it to be resistant to natural disasters, but then make our designs even more robust, that we are predicting the craziest event that could happen that would be, potentially dangerous to a small island developing nation, particularly your tsunami or your hurricanes or your earthquakes as well. But that's one of the things that, kind of gets lost in the conversation of nuclear energy isn't safe because for small island developing nations or for developing countries because of these extreme weather events. I have a spreadsheet of 20 to 50 extreme weather events that have been in areas where there are nuclear power plants and there was no damage, there was no release of radioactive material. Fukushima is the outlier.
Right. I bet no one's ever heard of the other 49 on the spreadsheet because there's nothing to say about them.
Exactly.
And that's the point, right?
Exactly.
That's the point.
Exactly.
Okay.
But I'd also like to add to that radiation is naturally occurring. So, this week at our booth upstairs, we're giving away bananas because if you eat one banana, you get the same amount of radiation as if you live next to a nuclear power plant for an entire year. So the United Nations Radiation Safety Board has done a significant study on what happened at Fukushima and the impact of the radiation on persons and the environment. And the conclusion that they came to in this very dense report is that the impact on the environment and persons is null. Because in science, we're not going to say zero, because we have to quantify it somehow. But what they came to was that the impact was null because even though there was some release of nuclear material and radiation, it's also naturally occurring in our environment. And so the higher you are from an elevation perspective, the more radiation that you're going to be exposed to. Just flying here, it's a significant more radiation than you would get living or working at a nuclear power plant for an entire year. So I think it's also important that we kind of normalize what radiation is and what it is not.
Yeah, I think it's really funny talking about radiation because if you look at where we get most of our radiation from, or artificial radiation, that's all in the medical field.
Yeah.
0.1% is coming from nuclear energy and being close to nuclear power plants. But people are comfortable going to the doctor, getting an X-ray, getting a CAT scan, getting an MRI. But when you look at the spread of where we're receiving radiation from, most of it is natural radiation, right? And just under half of it, of all the radiation that we receive, is coming directly from the medical industry. But we don't protest against cancer treatments,
No.
which we need. But it's also something that we need to consider to put into perspective. Everything around us is radioactive. The ocean is radioactive. We talk about the tritium release in Japan. The ocean has tritium naturally. We get radiation from the sun, radiation from the earth, radiation from the foods we eat. Inside our bodies is naturally radioactive. And so I think putting all of that into perspective when we do talk about radiation as this boogeyman cloud that is covering our industry, it's important to have that perspective.
And what's your experience of working in a nuclear environment as it is radiation something that you think about ever on your kind of day-to-day work? Is it something that you consider? Do you just forget about it? Is it a big deal?
So I would say before starting to work, so my background is mechanical engineering. So I didn't really have an idea of, how things work at the power plant. And as I've mentioned earlier, like when you look at the procedures that we have in the process and how everything is controlled, and you have the radiation protection team, and it really doesn't scare you anymore because everything is controlled. And I think, since we've touched on, radiation, safety, and Fukushima, I think that, the accidents that we've had has really led the industry to improve the safety protocols, the designs of the reactors, and this really shows the adaptability of the nuclear industry, the best practices, the knowledge sharing. And this is all very important for sustainability. And even implementing new technologies is really part of how the power plants are maintained and licensed, which really shows again that nuclear energy is sustainable, and it proves that.
It's always funny to me that the people who work the most closely with radiation are the people who are least scared of it. It's often people who have never, ever interacted with anything beyond background radiation who are the most worried about it. So
when I was an intern at a nuclear power plant, maybe naively, we used to have a competition around who could get the most radiation dose during your 4-month period, because it's so controlled in terms of, like, we have this saying, ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, that, we put shielding in place, we put barriers in place to minimize the amount. The most dose that I ever received, I was actually working an outage. I was on top of the reactor core during shutdown, uncoupling some of our control rods, which we use to control the reaction. And even in that case, the dose that I received was maybe 1/50th of what you would get in a normal year from, like, the lights. And so it's, as president of the International Youth Nuclear Congress, one of the main projects we're focused on for next year is also bringing laboratory exercises into schools. So our goal is to place these laboratory kits free of charge in regional locations globally, and they'll focus on things like practical laboratory exercises around radiation, around heat transfer. So, these core scientific principles that we're using really in any sort of industrial environment, but also because, as we look towards the future and making it more sustainable, we need to ensure that children are interested in and have access to STEM, so that interest can or essentially, we want these laboratory kids hopefully to be a catalyst for that interest in STEM, especially for young girls. Because if we're only using 50% of our workforce, we're never going to make it to net zero. So, like you guys said, I think that it's, in terms of the socialization, like, what is radiation and putting it into perspective is so important.
yeah, so go grab a banana from upstairs after this session. If you haven't already gone to the booth, it's in the back corner of the room. Look for the giant gummy bear. It will make sense when you go there. Perhaps to finish off in the last 10 minutes, you mentioned the boogeyman of nuclear not being safe.
She's a question.
Sorry?
There's a question.
Oh,
I think.
sorry, is there a question? Yes, you've got a question, yeah.
So I have the mic. Sorry, she said eating a banana is like living next to nuclear science. Is it right? Don't you think, like, if we already have, like, radiation that we can't rid of, like meds, when we accumulate, like, other radiations from nuclear power, it would be more nocive. Like, we can't get rid of meds, but we can get rid of nuclear power. That's my point. But I don't know how. know if you did get my point.
Oh, okay. So I think I understand what you're saying is essentially that, you know, we can't get rid of bananas, but nuclear energy, we can't get rid of medicine, but is nuclear energy providing an unnecessary dose?
What makes us like merge for like nuclear power when accumulated like radiation would hurt us more. Like we're going like we're adding something on radiation. We're not correcting the effects of the meds, but we're adding some radiation to our body.
So, coming out of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scientific community did a lot of studies around what is chronic low dose, what is the impact to the body. And what they found is that there is no quantifiable impact from chronic low dose. And actually, in some cultures, even historically, they've had radiation spas as a result because they think that it has like really positive impacts on the body. And so that's why in the power plants and, you know, kind of what we're in quantifying it as related to a banana, it's because that small dose, even if it's received over a long period of time, the negative impact to the body in science terms is null. So what you have to really be concerned about from a radiation perspective is like super high doses. So that's why doctors, when they do medical exams, for instance, like MRIs versus CAT scans, they have to weigh the risk versus the benefit of doing such procedures because these are really high amounts of radiation that are being targeted on a specific part of your body. It's the same with cancer treatments through radiation. And so those high doses are really the concern from a scientific perspective, especially on the basis of all of this information that we've collected in following people out of the disasters that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, I think to kind of address that as well is that, yes, we said that eating one banana is equivalent to getting the same radiation if you were to live within a mile of a nuclear power plant. And that's a really powerful statistic because it goes to demonstrate the redundancies and safeguards that we do incorporate as a part of the nuclear power plants, right? And I think your concern is that, you know, if we continue to build out more nuclear, we're going to have more exposure to radiation, right? That's your, but,
How would you convince someone who would like think that way?
right. So it goes back to the case of all the examples that we do have from all our power plants across the world. We do have safeguards that we put in. When you talk about radiation, we're stopping, you know, radiation alpha particles can be stopped by a piece of paper. You know, beta, gamma, neutrons stopped by, you know, concrete, steel. We know exactly how to shield ourselves from these types of from radiation, and we have been doing it, right? And so when we look at, okay, yes, we want to build 1, 2, 3, 4 hundreds of nuclear reactors, they're going to be built at the same level of safety or even higher than what we already have now. So we are going to eventually, essentially be limiting that radiation exposure because safety is a priority. And you can even look in the medical industry where we create radioisotopes for cancer treatment. Those radioisotopes are made in research reactors, nuclear research reactors, right? They have the same material. You have the same, because I've worked at a nuclear research reactor. You have the same worry about, you know, radiation dose. You carry around your dosimeter at a research reactor, the same research reactor that they're producing isotopes to treat cancer. It's a similar structure, right? We just have research reactors for medical isotope production, and we have nuclear reactors for power production, but we still have the same safeguards in place to limit the exposure to radiation in a way that it's safe for the workers, it's safe for people who are living nearby. No problem, yeah. Good question.
Do you think this worry about radioactivity in the environment from nuclear power stations will become kind of a harder battle to fight as nuclear reactors perhaps become more geographically prevalent with small modular reactors, a larger number of smaller reactors. People, on average, will inevitably be living closer to nuclear reactors. Is this something that we need to kind of address, perhaps as an industry, and with the education about nuclear power more generally?
Yeah, I think in the technology design of small modular reactors, because you have your conventional reactors, and we have this thing called the EPZ, the Environmental Protection Zone, which is essentially the zone that you would need to evacuate. Because we're scaling down to much smaller technologies, the EPZ, it doesn't need to be 10 miles, 20 miles, that zone. And so I think based on the design of the technology and even regulatory infrastructure that's being developed right now, you're looking at being able to live near small modular reactors you can be as close as 5 miles away from them. And that's, again, innately coming from the design, because we're looking at smaller reactors. It's going to have a smaller impact in the event of an incident, and so we don't need to, have this overly conservative EPZ as a way to, put in another redundancy in our safeguards.
Sure.
And so that makes small modular reactors more accessible and even safer than our current fleets. Innately within in the design and in the regulations that enforce strict standards.
And at the same time, what we've seen, through these studies that are now been following people for 70 plus years, is that low exposure to radiation is not problematic from a health perspective. What becomes problematic from a health perspective, quantifiably, is large doses.
Large doses.
Yeah, very, very large doses, which is why, the safety requirements around MPPs are so significant.
Yeah. So, final question to the three of you. What motivates you in your work? Because in addition to providing the world with the clean energy that it needs to continue its long march towards being fully developed and achieving net zero, one of the things about nuclear is that it's a credible antidote to the despair and the doom and gloom, particularly amongst the younger generation, to climate change. So what motivates you in your work?
For me, it's energy reliability. I was born and raised in Jamaica, and I came to the U.S. to study energy, and it just so happened that because Jamaica has sunlight most of the year, I immediately went into solar energy, and I was doing research there for a very long time. But my motivation for pursuing a technology that produces firm, clean, baseload power comes from the fact that there are blackouts, and there is during and in the aftermath of extreme weather events that I've had to live through growing up, and that's the primary reason why I wanted to be in energy. I did start in solar, but as I continue to be updated on the technology and see what technologies could be the most impactful, not only from a reliability perspective, but from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and from a net zero perspective, nuclear just ended up being the solution that I just jumped on there.
So when I was looking in high school, what I wanted to do, I wanted to contribute to the climate change mitigation discussion. So electricity generation is fundamental to life. And for me, nuclear engineering made sense because not only does it provide you access to clean electricity, but it also then provides access to higher standards of living, because it allows you to have sanitation, it allows you to have hospitals, it allows you to build infrastructure to create jobs. And so for me, that's really what drives me every single day, is knowing that, at the end of the day, the work that I'm doing is making a positive difference in people's lives. And I think that that's really, really important. I've traveled to 59 countries across the globe, and you see what the impacts are when you don't have access to clean, affordable, reliable electricity. And it's not just that you can't turn on your lights at home, you don't have access to Wi-Fi. It's these basic fundamental human needs that electricity enables.
So for me, and this is very personal, I think the opportunities that I get as a young female Emirati really drives me to do what I do, and it's it's the reason why, as they say, it's the reason why I get up every day in the morning. And when you work in an industry like that and you see the effect that it has not only in the UAE but also globally and socially, and how it's also stimulates economies and provide jobs and et cetera, and everything that we have discussed today, it really also brings more fulfillment.
Thank you. Well, that's perhaps a nice place to stop. If you've got any questions that you think of later this week or today, or you were maybe too shy to ask, do come upstairs into the back corner and come and talk to people in the blue T-shirts or anybody on this panel. Pick brains, ask questions. There's no question too small or too big. We're here to answer your questions. And so with that, I thank everybody for their attention and thank you for the question. And a round of applause for the panel, please. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.